Back in the summer of 2008, when I was living in a quaint little town called Redwood Creek in Texas, I had an experience that still gives me chills to this day. You see, our town was like any other close-knit community in the Lone Star State, filled with friendly folks who knew each other by name and gathered at the local diner for Sunday brunch. Life was simple, and the biggest thrill we usually had was the annual county fair. My friends and I were a tight-knit group, and we were always on the lookout for something exciting to do. So one warm summer night, we gathered at Jake's house for a bit of adventure. We'd heard whispers and spooky tales about Oakwood Cemetery, an old graveyard nestled on the outskirts of town. We arrived at the wrought iron gates that marked the entrance to the cemetery, and an eerie chill swept over us. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the ancient oak trees that loomed overhead, creating an ominous soundtrack to our impending adventure. Despite the creeping sense of unease, we pressed on. With our flashlights in hand, we ventured deeper into the cemetery, our footsteps echoing through the quiet night. The tombstones, weathered by time, stood like silent sentinels, and our flashlight beams cast long, ghastly shadows. The only sounds were the distant chirping of crickets, which seemed to grow louder with each step. Then it happened. A faint, otherworldly whisper that seemed to come from all around us. We froze in our tracks, our hearts pounding. Fearful but curious, we followed the eerie sound, our flashlights darting to and fro as we tried to pinpoint its source. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, and we could feel unseen eyes watching us. Soon, we stumbled upon a decrepit mausoleum that appeared centuries old. Its door swung open with an eerie creak, as if inviting us inside. The air within was frigid, and our breath hung in the darkness like gustly mist. Then we saw them. Apparitions, ghostly figures dressed in tattered clothing. They glided toward us with hollow eyes, their spectral hands reaching out. We felt their icy touch, and a paralyzing fear washed over us. In a frenzied panic, we fled the mausoleum and ran through the cemetery, the ghostly figures pursuing us relentlessly. It felt like an eternity, but we finally reached the cemetery gates and stumbled out onto the road. To this day, I can't explain what we witnessed that night. It defied all logic and reason. Oakwood Cemetery had always had a reputation for being haunted, but I never thought I'd experience something so terrifying and inexplicable. On a melancholic, rainy day in early autumn, I decided to make a pilgrimage to the grave of my beloved grandfather, who had been gone for several years. The sky was shrouded in a thick blanket of slate-gray clouds, and the persistent drizzle seemed to mirror the tears in my heart as I navigated the quiet streets of our small town. My grandfather had been a kind and wise man, a steady presence throughout my childhood. His passing had left an unfillable void in my life, and I often found solace in visiting his resting place. On this particular day, I felt an inexplicable pull, as though he was calling me back to the cemetery. As I strolled through the drenched streets, the raindrops tapped a mournful rhythm on my umbrella. The trees lining the path, their leaves now a sodden mess, whispered tales of past secrets in the rustling breeze. It was the kind of rainy day my grandfather used to love, a time when he would share stories of his own life as we sat together by the fireplace. Upon reaching the cemetery, I approached his grave, a simple yet dignified marker engraved with his name and the years of his life. I stood there, my umbrella providing a small sanctuary from the rain, and I began to reminisce about the moments we had shared. As I paid my respects, a strange sensation washed over me. It was as if my grandfather's presence lingered here, not in the form of a ghostly apparition, but as a comforting presence. I felt as though he were with me, a whispered memory echoing in the rain-soaked air. With a heavy heart, I turned to leave, but it was then that I began to notice something uncanny. At the corner of my eye, I caught fleeting glimpses of my grandfather. It was as if his spirit were appearing and disappearing like a wisp in the rain. I saw him near the old oak tree that he had always loved to sit under during family picnics. His silhouette appeared briefly by the grave of my grandmother, his lifelong love and companion. I even saw him standing by the entrance of the cemetery, as though he were bidding me a silent farewell. Each glimpse of his presence was accompanied by a feeling of warmth and comfort, as if he were assuring me that he was still with me in spirit. It was an eerie and yet profoundly moving experience, one that filled my heart with both sadness and joy. As I walked back through the rain-soaked streets, my initial sense of comfort and connection with my late grandfather began to twist into something altogether more disturbing. The glimpses of his presence had shifted from heartwarming to unsettling. With each sighting, his figure seemed to become more distorted and grotesque, as if his spirit were decaying before my very eyes. His once kind eyes now gleamed with malevolence, and the warmth that had initially surrounded me had turned into a suffocating dread. My heart raced, and the rain seemed to grow colder, seeping through my skin like icy fingers. As I quickened my pace, the glimpses of my grandfather became more frequent, and his presence grew more oppressive. It was as though he were closing in on me, his intentions becoming increasingly sinister. In a panic, I reached the edge of the cemetery and stumbled into the rain-soaked street. But instead of relief, I found myself trapped in a nightmare. My grandfather's grotesque apparition stood before me, his eyes hollow and malevolent, his grin a nightmare of jagged teeth. He extended a skeletal hand toward me, and I felt an irresistible force pulling me toward him. Desperation surged through me as I struggled to break free from his malevolent grip, but it was futile. The rain intensified, becoming a torrential downpour that seemed to obscure the world around me. I was engulfed in a nightmarish tempest, the world around me warping and distorting as I was drawn closer to my grandfather's horrifying figure. His voice, once comforting and familiar, became a haunting cacophony of whispers and shrieks that echoed in my mind. I felt as though I were being consumed by darkness, my very soul slipping away. And then, with a final, blood-curdling scream, I awoke in my bed, drenched in cold sweat. It had all been a horrifying nightmare, a twisted vision that had left me shaken to the core. The rain outside had subsided, and the first light of dawn filtered through my window. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me, a lingering sense that my visit to the cemetery had awakened something malevolent and ancient. As I tried to push the disturbing images from my mind, I couldn't help but wonder if my late grandfather's spirit had truly been trying to reach out to me.